Now, Hawke's Bay Regional Council is actively investigating freshwater storage sites to carry excess winter water through dry periods in summer. We certainly have seen one of the worst dry periods in generations. And wearing the hat of Water Holdings Hawke's Bay is Director Hugh Ritchie and joins us now. Hugh, now, of course, the Tukituki River has been a hotspot for debate around what the best way to do water storage is. This particular government, in particular Shane Jones, right early on, when they're having coalition talks, said large storage was out and small storage was in. What sort of progress have you made over these past 3 years, and where does that leave Hawke's Bay going into the future?
Well, for the last 3 years, we obviously took up the residual assets of the old scheme. Looking at the site, looking at the ability close under the ranges to store water. So again, when you're doing water storage, the ability to fill the storage reliably is critical, as well as where you can hold it safely in an environment and geotechnical site that actually the water will stay in. Now, Hawke's Bay soils are quite young. They did a lot of work. They spent $18 million investigating sites all through central Hawke's Bay. They didn't just choose one site and start there. So a lot of exploratory work has been done to understand what the options are. And obviously it boiled down, in 2010 to the Makarora site. The Regional Council have come back in again this summer, has really highlighted, amongst other places in the country, that water is an absolutely critical component resource that we need to use. When Tukituki River got to an all-time low, even though it's on halfway through its increased low flow regime has been changed under Plan Change 6. Again, it got lower than it's ever been and got hotter than it's ever been. So the reality is, without putting extra water into the system, even for the environmental side of the river, there's not enough water there to do it. It's not the fact that the extraction was going on, it's actually the fact that there just wasn't any rain in the ranges to make the rivers flow. So we're part of a much bigger stakeholder group that's looking, among other things, it's not just storage, it's looking at management, it's looking at managed aquifer recharge, it's looking at maybe, different types of farming, land use change, all the options to see how we can conserve water. But part of that work was also looking at options. And again, they went through old work, new work, desktop work to try and identify new sites and open up the opportunities. Coming back to your original point, though, around scale, at some point, to keep river flows up, keep, community supplies going, and have water available for industrial use or irrigation or land use change, you could have 4 or 5 small dams, or you could have one big one. There's no conclusion made yet, but the reality is, if you haven't got 4 or 5 small sites, but you can do it with one site, then sometimes, as long as you can meet all the other environmental expectations, all the other parameters that the government have put in place in their issue around water storage, then scale is just one area that obviously we have to have a conversation around. But certainly at this stage, there's no decisions made around scale or size.
Regional water security is a major problem for nearly every region in this country, and we have proven examples of where a 4-water-pronged approach works, from the catchment right through to urban and industrial sort of supply. Why has there not been any sort of push through from how strong they've been on how much economic and environmental benefit can come from one large scheme?
Well, again, we've obviously the Hawke's Bay with the Tukituki especially and the Makarora, it's been really hard to have that conversation with politicians. Obviously they get quite worried about the history and the baggage around it. So we've really been focused on trying to get a community engagement going, understand the community's values and desires and wants around all those things. And I think there's, probably the last go around, I think the community was worried that the risk of increased activity versus the benefit the river was going to get delivered to was was in balance. And so we've been really looking at how we can look at that balance between environment and use, water use, and see if we can rebalance that. And so that's been part of our plan, to have that conversation, not come up with any predetermined outcome or idea, but let's get the values, let's get that demand and understand the demand. I mean, there isn't even how much water do we need even for status quo in 50 years' time based on climate change predictions. So there's a whole lot of work that needs to be done to make us understand, because when you do build these things, there's going to be a lot of money involved, and to build something that's only going to be sort of useful for 5 years is hardly worth it. We really have to get an idea of what the future demand would be. As an example, even the stream depleting takes currently, which basically lost the surety of their water when the plan change 6 came through and changed the low flow and the tuki-tuk, or the trigger points, from 25. They eventually go to 52, but at the moment they're at 4,700 litres a second. So those takes now are very unreliable. To provide water to take out those, so the water loss from those takes basically is about 4 or 5 million cubic metres. If you future-proof that to mid-century, that's about 10 to 12 million cubic metres. So again, that's just taking that one little parcel of water. So if we looked at the total demand going forward, then volume is going to be a really critical component to get right as to what we're going to need to make it work.
And a report that was delivered to Council last month predicted the region's annual GDP will fall by 120 million a year by the middle of the century if nothing is done about water security. Catchment groups have been a fantastic thing that's come out of the last 5 years, and as you said, about sharing values around it collectively. Do you believe that the collective values are now starting to understand their food security and their water security with the urban population growth?
I think that generally the urban population, especially in Hawke's Bay in the light of the last summer, but even before that, I think really did understand the linkage between food and also their prosperity. You can tell when the shops are down and the farming community is struggling because the shopping and everything else, does fall very rapidly. So I think there is that genuine linkage. Having said that, there's always groups that just won't see it and see basically the linkage between intensive agriculture and water quality as being the only thing that's the risk that should be considered. And look, I accept that. We've got to be very careful about making sure that intensive agriculture doesn't have an effect. But the reality is, if we want to get significant land use change from, ruminant production, for want of, an example, into, cropping or intensive crops or horticulture, actually water is the guaranteed enabler. It's not, we can't do it without water. You just won't spend the money on the permanent structures, or we won't get the contracts for those specialist seed crops and things like that without water. So water is actually the enabler for that land use change. And again, enabling a significant amount of irrigation to be performing consistently means that some of the surrounding hinterland that hasn't got water, but this year alone in this drought, that was affecting people from the ranges to the coast, and so again, being able to generate feed supply and keep people going locally is another absolute benefit that having reliable water is going to create.
Hugh, I know you're heavily involved in the process of coordinating feed through the Hawke's Bay. If we were to think about pre-planning for a season ahead, potentially to be equivalent, what would your advice be to farmers now in winter to plan ahead?
Planning ahead is the critical thing. I mean, we as an example, 2006 was the last time we bought supplementary grain in to augment our own supplies to generate, provide for farmers to take on. We bought 300 tonnes in that year. This year we bought just under 3,000 tonnes in. So that sort of gives you an example. And we had basically 2 full-time people from the sort of start of COVID lockdown, right, full-time, just bagging grain and getting grain ready for going out. So the biggest thing we saw was people have to give us an idea of not just what they need this week or 2 weeks' time. They actually have to really think through, and give lead time for people to actually generate feed. I mean, we could do it, we could find feed, but we just couldn't do it, the next day. And so, we have several situations, people ring up and say, can I have 10 tonnes? And those guys are now over 70, 80 tonnes total. And yet if we had booked and ordered 70 or 80 tonnes, I know that you can't predict how long, but you just have to be a little bit more, I think, a little bit more realistic in your expectation. If it hasn't rained by X, then you're going to need feed till June or whatever like that, and then plan that, because it just makes it so much easier to forward book feed and get it at a price that's realistic.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Hugh Ritchie, for taking the time to join us. Of course, he is wearing the hat as Water Holdings Hawke's Bay Director, and there Hugh wears many, many hats across the industry, has and will continue to do, I know.
This is Sarah's Country.